Pastors in the United Methodist Church are always chairs of the nominations committee. The nominations committee is the committee that appoints people, or nominates, as the name would imply, to serve on other committees. As a pastor, I am on all of the committees. I even get to be an ex officio member of the United Methodist Women, so go figure that. But I don't vote or play an active role on the others. The only committee that I chair and vote in is the nominations committee. So I think maybe as the chair of the nominations committee, what draws me immediately to the text that we just read or presented from John's Gospel is, why would Jesus have made Judas the treasurer? Judas, who according to the text and what we read about him in the Gospels, is a thief and a liar. Why would he be put in charge of the money, of what the disciples would have used to buy food and supplies for the day? I think maybe it's because money isn't as important to Jesus as it is to you and me. Or maybe because Jesus doesn't look at money the same way we do. There are other much weightier issues here in this gospel passage. Issues relating to mortality and to death. Death is a heavy subject, and it's not one that we tend to be keen to talk about. Sophia, the mother in the situation comedy Golden Girls, once said, "I used to live at a nursing home. The angel of death visited more often than the grandchildren." Death is one of these topics that makes us uncomfortable, and that's why we've developed so many jokes about it, as a way of easing the tension on this. But we are right now deep within the season of Lent, a season that begins on Ash Wednesday, when the sign of the cross is made with ashes on our forehead, as we hear and contemplate the words, "Remember you came from death, and to death you shall return." And Jesus is with us to help us look at this weighty topic. Jesus is aware of his death. He does not hide from it, and he does not skirt it. Mary comes in and pours some of this expensive perfume on his feet. And when Judas, who we know is a liar, protests that this was done, Jesus says, "Do not protest her. She is helping me prepare for my burial." He is aware of his own death. Last year, Dina and I lost a mutual friend, my old preaching and Bible professor, Gail O'Day. And she was an expert in the Gospel of John. And her reading of this text deeply influences me. And she sees the significance of what's going on here, going back to the reason they've gathered for this meal in the first place. Just prior to this passage, Jesus has been called to the scene because Lazarus has died. And when he finally arrives, he's been dead for 3 days. And Martha confronts him in a somewhat accusatory fashion and said, "If you had been here, my brother would not be dead." And Jesus, as we all know, is going to raise him from the dead, but initially he doesn't do that. He cries and he grieves with them, leading them through this tender work of mourning of faithful people. And then he says to remove the stone that's in front of the tomb. But Martha protests. Lazarus has been dead for days. Already there is a stench. But he orders the stone to be rolled back anyway. And then with a loud voice says, "Lazarus, come out." And miraculously and weirdly, Lazarus comes out of the tomb, still wrapped up in his burial clothes. And Jesus demands that he be unbound. Jesus knows something about death. And he knows that he has the authority over the powers of life and death. And it infuriates his enemies. So much so that John tells us that at that point they intensify their plans to see that Jesus is arrested and put to death publicly. And not only that, according to John, they want to kill Lazarus too. They want to remove any signs of anything that Jesus has done. His enemies understand earthly control, the things over which they have authority, like money and influence and power. They don't understand that Jesus is much bigger than that, and he is able to do things that they cannot even imagine. Mary appreciates that, and so she respects him with this gesture of pouring the ointment on his feet, and then leaning down in a very humble gesture to wipe his feet with her hair. Mary understands that Jesus' death will have something to do with her death as well. And for you and I, as people of faith, our relationship to Christ influences how we live, and it influences how we die. It influences our priorities while we live, so that we understand that what we have is not ours, but something that's been put into our hands. That influences how we use our time and our abilities. It influences how we use our money. We don't have to be scared and hoard what we have. We can be generous. We can love our neighbors. We can care for one another. And we can care for the poor, because we know our life is in God's hands. And none of us has any earthly idea of what is going to happen to us after we die. We love to imagine. We love to conjecture. I think of all the people, whenever we get together for a funeral of a loved one, who say, oh, I know he's up there doing this, or I bet she's up there doing that, but none of us knows. All we know is that time is going to come for us. And so we trust in God when that time comes. The one thing that I fervently believe is that when you and I experience that moment, it will probably be something that none of us could have possibly imagined, because it is all completely from God. And like Mary, our relationship to Christ is going to influence how we live out our mortal days, how we use those things that have been put into our hands, and how we face our closing moments. It is through Christ that the stench of decay is overpowered by the fragrance of perfume. And it is through Christ that the reality of death is met with the promise of the resurrection. Amen.